So our opening keynote is Amanda Brock, who is the CEO of Open UK and an executive producer of OpenCon. Amanda has over 25 years of legal experience shaping open source legal frameworks and shaping internet law since the 2000s. She is a strong advocate for openness in all aspects of technology, hardware, software, standards, and data, and has served and serves on numerous advisory boards, including UKRI's digital research infrastructure and exascale exercises, among many others. And her talk today is titled The Rise of Open Source in Research.
So good morning, Coventry. Getting here has been the hardest journey I've ever had to a conference, so I'm so pleased to be on time and in front of you this morning. Thank you very much, Romain and Heather. You've been so patient with me. It's not been easy, I know. And thank you to all the committee and Warwick University. This is a great venue. I absolutely love this room. I don't know if you've noticed, but I don't have a headset or a mic or anything because they've got this really clever thing at the front. If I wander too far and you stop being able to hear me, put your hands up and wave at me or something so I know that I'm out of the mic range. So I'm Amanda Brock. I am a lawyer by trade, very aging to hear 25 years of experience, but about 20 years ago, 17 in 2008, I joined this company, Canonical. And I guess I had about 10, 15 years of experience as a lawyer at that stage. And I thought I knew what open source was because I could give you a legal definition of open source. And the legal definition is pretty much the one that you'll see governments use, public sector use, which is that the code, the source, the secret sauce that used to be shared, that's kept private, is shared. So that human readable source is public and that it has an OSD approved license. And we'll come on to what that is in a minute. So joining Canonical in 2008, I was very much somebody from a commercial corporate background, and I was only meant to be there 3 months, but I stayed 5 years because I really fell in love with open source. And this morning, I'm going to share a bit of why that happened to me. It was a huge privilege to work on Ubuntu for 5 years. And after I left Canonical, I stayed very engaged in a lot of the projects around open source on governance and compliance, because of course, open source has engineers like yourself at the heart of it, but it also is an ecosystem that makes up that community, that village of openness. And it includes people like me who do governance, it includes people who organize conferences like this, and people who do sort of community building, marketing, a whole span of different skill sets. And that's going to be important and relevant as we move on as well. So as part of that governance thing, I did some work on this book, and it is the worst thing I've ever done. And you work with academics, so you'll probably understand this. It took 5 years to get this book over the line with 26 different lawyers as authors. Herding cats, whole new dimension, you know, it's like space cats. And it's 640 pages long, and I have chronic ADHD, so it took me 4 days to go start to finish, which I think I had to do 4 times. Not trying to sell you it. The beauty of it is we negotiated open access and got a sponsor for it. So that QR code takes you to my website, which is the easiest place to find the book and download it. And what I've discovered this week, and I'll explain more where, is that most people seem to be interested from your community, and you may not agree with this, but the people I've met this week in the commercialization chapter, which is chapter 16 in which I wrote, I've got to leave straight after this session, but if you want to talk to me more about any of that, or if you want to ask questions, feel free just to ping me on the contact details you'll get at the end. So feel free to take the book, distribute it, use it as you like. When we launched the book, we had 6 female authors who took part in a panel session in Raleigh, I think it was, at All Things Open. And it was really strange because it went viral. And it went viral not on the internet per se, but in China. And what that led to is a translation of the book being published this autumn in Mandarin. They've got off really lightly because there's about a quarter of the length when you do it in Mandarin. It was in English for some reason, and I have no idea if they've cut stuff. I spent a lot of my life doing this, and I traveled to easier places to get to than Coventry today. But I talk about open source a lot, and I suppose it's become my bread and butter. I run an organisation in the UK that you may or may not have heard of. We're only just over 5 years old and we're tiny. We generally operate on 2 to 4 staff, and then we have a bunch of contractors and several hundred volunteers. So each year we'll have 400 or 500 people who volunteer in different capacities to make things tick. And we are very focused on open source, but our mission is UK leadership and global collaboration. And I think in a time of geopolitical shift, again, we'll come to that as we move on, it's really critical to remember that whatever we do here in the UK has that global focus, and we want to be open, we want to be accessible to all and to collaborate globally. So for us, that's become more and more important as time's gone by. And we're unique in 2 or 3 ways. Because we're a young baby organization and open source, we have the advantage of knowing that you can't do software without thinking about data, hardware, standards, and increasingly all of those fit into AI. So from day one, we've covered that span. We also very quickly worked out that although we were meant to be set up as an industry organization, if we tried to be an industry organization for UK companies, we were going to be tiny and stay tiny forever, because our companies get US investment, they get sold to the US. And what that means is that although a lot of people actually stay here, most of their employers are not in the UK. So we decided to focus on people, which is kind of the open source way anyway. But we focus on people and rely on their employers to come into the game and to help us with sponsorship and contributions to reports, etc. So we're unique in the breadth of what we do. We're unique in the people we focus on. And I guess we're unique in that we're free. You know, if you want to participate in one of our projects, you can. We're not paid to play. We do 3 things. I'm going to run through these quickly. The slides are detailed more so you can go and look at them afterwards. We build that community, and finding that community wasn't easy in the beginning, but bit by bit we have. And the reason it wasn't easy is that we work in these global silos. We partner with people all over the world, and we work on our projects. In lockdown, I found out I lived 6 doors down from a woman who was on a panel with me. I had no idea she was there. And for me, that's a great example of this geographical silo that we're all in. So we try to bring people together across the silos. It creates great networking opportunities, but it also is something that we've built into a recognition program. We currently have nominations open for an award that close on Sunday. It's free to nominate yourself or somebody else or a project or an enterprise or an organization. The 3 shortlisted nominees in each category will be invited to a black tie dinner at the House of Commons on the 4th of December. You don't have to wear a proper black tie. We're all very laid back about it. But it's a nice opportunity for people, and nothing is charged for it. It's all paid from our sponsorship, which is the case of most of what we do. Few stats on the sort of engagement that we have. We use that cohesive voice that we build with this community to influence law and policy. So when we Brexited, one of the things we discovered was that most of the European lawyers with deep knowledge in open source were based in the UK. Not all, but most. So we respond to legislation, we respond to proposals, and we do policy initiatives. Do a lot of research and reporting. That sort of research and policy stuff for me is like a multitude of sins. So we've done things from having one of the biggest events at COP26. We signed the Green Digital Declaration at COP29. We're taking a data center project to COP30. We do a lot around sustainability. I was invited to the Global AI Action Summit in February in Paris, and we're working on a fringe event for the Impact Summit in India, an AI openness event. So we do all sorts of different, I suppose, disciplines or sectorial things. We, really have quite a broad reach. Each year we do a survey and we do a report on open source in the UK. It's taken various guises, and increasingly we do reporting around AI and openness. And if you're interested in that, we do a sort of 6 monthly update. We just published one in July, which is the stage right, screen left. And the other one is from the Action Summit. And we're quite proud of that because we produced it in real time while I was there and shared that before the end of the summit. We're working on a report on the India landscape now, and that will be part of what we do for the fringe event at the Indian Summit. We just did a tour of these 4 cities where we had about 800 people engage with us around AI openness. third thing we do is so skills development and learning. Our annual conference is around 800 attendees in central London. It's usually $250, $299 a ticket. It's probably a $1,000 ticket if you were selling it commercially. Everything we do is on a not-for-profit basis, and we give away a lot of tickets. So if that's still out of your budget and you want to come, you'll get a free ticket. Just contact me. The way we do it is all the content, apart from the plenaries, comes from CFPs, which I'm sure you're all used to. So nobody pays to speak, which means our content's good. A lot of the open source conferences you go to are heavily dominated by sponsor speakers. So if you're interested, I think the CFP will open October. There's room for people on CFP committees. There's room for speakers. I love this whole poster thing. I keep hearing about it. We've never done it, so we might look at doing that as well. And I would really like if we have enough space to have a track that is sort of focused on what you're all doing and the sort of academic software space. So that's a bit about me in Open UK. I have a timer here because I'll wander. I want to start your day on open source by taking a step back. I told you I thought I knew it all and I knew what open source was when I joined Canonical, and it turned out I didn't. The legal piece around the definition of open source really, really matters. And if you don't take anything else away from this talk, please take this away. So I was told in Paris yesterday that I was wrong about this, and I promise you I'm not. I've been doing this 20 years, and I've met a lot of people who will discuss with you what open source is. There is a reason that this is so important, which I'll come to in a minute. So if something is open source, source is shared, but it's on a license that meets the open source definition. Now, not everything, not every license you see on GitHub will meet that definition. And it used to be that GitHub didn't have in their dropdown a notice about this. They do now, and it will take you to the licenses. I think there's something like 85 of these licenses approved by the Open Source Initiative. But even if it's not approved by the Open Source Initiative, to be open source, the code has to be distributed on a license that meets the open source definition. Now, I don't care that you don't know what that says, and I know you don't know what that says because I don't know what it says, and nobody in open source can just tell you. Even the guy who wrote it, when I interviewed him, had a crib sheet in front of him. What I care about is 5 and 6. And 5 and 6 really sit at the heart of everything open source. Anyone can use your code for any purpose. Now, what that means is no commercial restrictions, right? So you'll see lots of projects that call themselves open source, but have an anti-commercialization or say that the code can only be used for academic purposes. That's great. I have no problem with that, but it's not open source. And the reason this matters is that it creates a free flow. It creates a situation where when you share the code, the next person can use it, they can develop on top of it, they can iterate, they can build, but they don't have to come back to you for permissions in terms of using the code. They do for branding and copyright and trademark and all that sort of stuff, but they don't have to come back to you. They can rely on the ability to use the code and that they can pass it on to the next person and the next and the next. And that free flow is crucial to why open source has been so successful. So when I got into this, we were knocking at doors and trying to persuade people to use Ubuntu and to commercialize Ubuntu in their organizations. And we were blocked by gatekeepers. We were blocked by lawyers like me. We were blocked by procurement professionals, and we were blocked by finance who had to approve it. And those people are super risk averse. It's easier to say no than yes. And you don't get sacked for saying no, so you do that. What we've seen is the rise of the developer over the last 10 years, shifting things. And that rise and that ability to shift has been largely down to digitalization and access to GitHub, GitLab, whatever it is you're using as a repository that is collaborative and open. And the ability to just take code and bring it into your organization, to recycle it and reuse it, means that you don't have to go through those gatekeepers. So the risk professionals who were trying to close off use of open source at that point of contract are totally bypassed. Now, what that's meant is that we're looking at a world where today 96% of commercial stack software has dependencies on open source, and 76% is open source. Somebody said 97% has dependencies yesterday. Maybe they're right, but it's a high number. And I know Microsoft's a sponsor here today, and they're also a sponsor of Open UK. So I say this with the best of intentions, but they used to be public enemy #1 in open source. I used to know a lot of jokes, and the punchline was always Microsoft. I can't tell them anymore because there's been a shift, and that shift led to 2018. My mate Steve Wally, who's one of their open source leads, on a stage in Edinburgh, explaining why Microsoft had moved to open source and the journey they've been on. And that journey is a journey that every company in the tech sector has been on. And it's a journey that I think all enterprises have been on, and increasingly the public sector and academia. And they explain the journey, the shift, has been based on 3 different things. The first is that any developer, and I'm looking around the room, a lot of you are super young and you fit this category, and some of you who are more my age will still fit this category. Anybody who's been taught to code in the last 10, 15, maybe even 20 years has been taught to use open source. They've been taught to recycle and reuse code and to build on what's already there, to stand on the shoulders of giants. Now, if you're doing that, you need an environment that lets you do it. And Microsoft realized that they were having a problem in recruiting because they weren't letting people do open source. So that was the first reason. The second reason, some of their customers were coming to them and asking for specific technology. And that technology was named open source packages, the likes of Docker for containerization. So they had to be able to distribute it. And they didn't want to be commercially distributing something without a level of engagement. So they get involved in the projects as well. And their third reason was Azure. You can't run a public cloud or a decent platform today without running open source. Your infrastructure is almost entirely dependent on it. And again, to do that well, you want to have skin in the game. So that's why enterprises use open source. Why do governments want it? Historically, I would have said that they want it because they're avoiding lock-in, and they want to create code that they fund that is accessible and can be recycled and reused. They want the code to have value. Being open source per se will not avoid lock-in, and that's a huge challenge. You can still lock the code in, or lock the customer in, I should say, by having a service layer that traps them. So we see that in the cloud, where things like egress fees stop them moving from one provider to another, even though it's all built on open source. And the competition authorities in the UK have just done a big investigation into that. We see it with business models, and there are only 8 business models in open source. There have been 8 business models since 2008. They're still the same. They have different names, and there's nuanced changes to them. But when you give something away, there's only so many ways you can leverage it to make money. So what they do is use a model called open core, where you have freemium. So you have an open source core, and then you have software around it that you commercialize that may not be open. And that can create difficulties in terms of your ability to move from providers. So don't rely on something being open source, avoiding lock-in, but that is what government is trying to achieve. That's what the public sector want when they use open source. 2025 has changed that slightly. And we've been dealing with geopolitics, and we've been dealing with sovereignty since Brexit. And you'd be surprised by the globally collaborative open source community and how some of the EU has been. The Commission won't let us talk because we're called Open UK at open source events anymore. So I haven't been on a stage in Brussels since 2020. I think the last time was actually the day of Brexit. Trump has put that on a different level, and you'll see a lot of conversations about building sovereign stacks, things like Eurostack, and a lot of them are talking about how that works with open source, and open source can indeed be the cornerstone of those stacks because you can't build a sovereign stack without it. However, we also, as you'll remember from my opener, my explanation of Open UK, we're a globally collaborative community, and that matters more today than it ever has. So I could give you a whole talk about the nuances of this, but you should be aware that that's now one of the key reasons for using open source. So I've talked to you about all of our success. I've talked about how great it's been, how we've managed to surmount all of these challenges and all these gatekeepers, and that we've won, and 96% of software is dependencies, yada, yada, yada. But actually, we've never had more challenges, and we're sort of a victim of our own success, because that pace of adoption has not been matched with a pace of understanding. And what we've seen through the whole history of open source is FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. It was used in the operating system wars when Microsoft was still public enemy #1, and it's used today by companies who are disingenuous. Now, the key to that is understanding what open source is, and it's not always done intentionally, but anybody who calls something that is not freely available for anyone to use without those restrictions, without commercial restrictions or usage restrictions or political restrictions saying you can't send it to Russia. Without those restrictions, it can be open source. With them, it cannot. So that's always your key giveaway. But people who will who want you to believe something has the benefits of open source without giving that free usage will still call it open source, and that creates a lot of confusion. We came up with this as a way to help people in their language and help simplify it. So the opposite of open source is not closed source. The opposite of open source is proprietary. And we have sort of 3 categories of software evolving today. If this confuses you, ignore it, but if it helps you, great. And there is this 3rd category, which is open, but it is not open source because it has restrictions, and that's public or distributed source. Nothing wrong with it, but just acknowledge what it is so you're not seen as being disingenuous or causing confusion. Amongst the disingenuous, we've had a lot of shift in our own industry where people have implied something is becoming more open, as we saw here with Elastic a few years ago. The prodigal child, they've returned it back to openness, having moved away with a license that restricted usage. This doubling down on open blog post was actually about moving away. And one of the challenges we have in some ways is all of you. So I am Gen 1 in our definition of the generations of open source. And I'm Gen 1 not by my age, right? I have a board member who's a year younger than me, and she's Gen 2. I'm Gen 1 because I'm a true believer. I'm Gen 1 because I fell in love with the principles of open source, the social movement, the concept of giving back and sharing and collaborating. I think that's where our digital environment should be. Gen 2 are totally different. They are people, and many of you will be those people, and there's nothing wrong with it, and it's not age dependent. Who've come to the technology first. You've started using technology that you think is great. You've started using the methodologies and the tools, and you've decided that you like this stuff. And you've then later learned, or maybe not even learned, about open source. Lots of people use it, don't understand what it is, don't understand the licensing. And some of you could even be Gen 3, AI in the future, who've come into this because you're doing quantum or AI and you're doing something that's open. I think critical is getting Gen 2 and 3 to understand this, what open source is, because if you don't understand it, you're enabling people to undermine the whole future of it. Now, these are not the only challenges in understanding it. We have challenges because, as I said, we're a victim of our own success. Suddenly, our national infrastructure, our critical national infrastructure, is built on open source. Governments have never been more worried about attacks on software, about security than they are today, rightly, because we live in a digital infrastructure, our services are delivered across it. And they're putting burdens on those that create open source. They're asking for it to be secure. They're asking for it to meet certain standards, compliance, and curation. We use the word curation in open source to talk about good technical hygiene and governance. So we're seeing this extra pressure on the open source developers. And you'll all have seen this before, I'm guessing, but it is a reality. I mean, I know some of these people who are not necessarily in Nebraska, but there are people in Nebraska. This was based on somebody. There are people who are the maintainers of projects because they've created them, and there's a couple of people who are then bearing the pressure, holding the internet up. I'm trying to think of the name. Log4j was a great example of that. And when you had Shell4j, which was a security breach, you saw a very small team, I think it was 2 or 3 people, who had a critical part of every website in their care. What was really interesting about that was the pace of fix when there was the breach. Everything that was open source was fixed very quickly because many eyes make bugs shallow, as they say, and we saw lots of people come together and fix it. But a whole lot of proprietary products and websites that people didn't understand had open source in them were also dependent on it. And so we have this huge burden on the creators and maintainers of open source. A lot of them are doing it in their jobs, but many of them still do it as volunteers. They might work in one thing and volunteer in another project. I once asked an engineer, a female engineer, a good friend, why does she do open source? And she said, because software managers are shit. And I was like, okay. And she said, well, they don't let you do what you want to do in the day. They don't let you fix the things that you need to fix. So you do that in your own time. And then you realize that everybody else has the same problems. So you open it up and then people contribute because they also want the fixes to the problems. They'll scratch the itch analogy. So a lot of people still do stuff in their spare time. Here in the UK, I think I'm the last person standing on this. I was part of a Cabinet Office advisory board in 2010 that led to this policy that the UK would be open source first in its public sector. Shortly after it was released, I think there was a shift to David Cameron and it just disappeared. So we didn't do much to make it happen. It is still technically the UK's policy on open source. In the UK, we have 4.1 million GitHub accounts. Now, that is a really terrible measure of open source, right? I have a GitHub account. I've never contributed anything to any code base. I do contribute to open source, but I can't do code. I don't do it. It's the best measure we've got, and it's what everybody uses across the planet. So we're at least measuring like for like. So we have 4.1 million GitHub accounts. I have report after report showing how many commits we've got, how many newbies we have, how many real contributors to open source projects there are. Not going to go into that today, but if you want to find out more about that, go a few slides back and there's a QR. What's important about this 4.1 million is when we compare like for like, we have 6.1% of the UK population who have GitHub accounts. That is more per capita than any country in the world, which sort of aligns with the fact that we are #1 in Europe by number of developers contributing to open source projects and number of lines of code that we commit. We lost the status in AI for a period of time and we seem to have it back, although the measures are quite difficult, but we look like we're back to being #1 in Europe. Am I competitive? A little bit, but it's all so good to be able to show those who are funding you why you do this, how you do this, and how good you are at doing this, right? And I think that will apply to all of you in your jobs. Certainly that's the conversation I'm hearing about your contributions to open source. So we'll get onto that a little bit more in a minute, but understanding the importance of what you're doing and the value it adds. And we do have a whole formula how we do economic value, but we're able to show that too. I think for academics and people in the academic sector, this is quite interesting because as you look across this heat map, you'll see pockets and they often represent academia. So you can often spot like Dundee, which is near where I'm from, has a big gaming centre. So I can see Dundee on this map and I know it's all the gamers, right? St Andrews is another little pot point. You probably see Coventry is relatively warm. So getting a bit more into what you all do, I spent yesterday in Paris, which all sounds very glamorous. It's never as glamorous as it sounds, I promise you. And it's partly why it was hard to get here. It's at the OECD with, interestingly, mainly academics talking about RSE. And I put a post on LinkedIn last night that said RSE or SRE. You all know what SRE is, right? Software Resilience Engineer. Because I think that if you're an RSE, you should be able to become an SRE and vice versa. Because I think you should be developing interchangeable skills. And that was part of the conference, the roundtable discussion in Paris yesterday. There is an output from the OECD as well as from me on LinkedIn with some of the key takeaways if you want to see them. And I think that the conversation focused on policy, and OECD says they are going to produce a policy about access to research software by the end of 2026. Now, I just showed you the UK's 2011 policy saying that we're open source first in the public sector. Switzerland last year, they created a law saying that the public sector has to be open source. If it's public money, it's going to be open source, right? It's going to be accessible and available to everybody. It's not going to work. It just won't work. It doesn't work. Can't work. It can't work because a policy or a law on its own for something as technical as what you all do is there to be abused. What you actually need is how. So the US, they put out their AI action plan maybe 3-4 weeks ago, and it says they're going to encourage open source weights and models, but it doesn't say how. So how are you going to do that? How are you going to make this happen is the key. So this was part of the discussion yesterday, that we don't just want a policy. Some people were calling it a policy framework, but you actually need the operational side of it. You need to know how you're going to do this. One of the key things they were talking about yesterday is who you all are, right? And apparently a lot of the people who contribute academic software are academics. Now we see the same in the NHS, we've seen it for years. You get surgeons who've learned to code and they want to build a product, and they go off and do it and they write terrible code, and because they're surgeons, they have egos and people don't want to tell them it's shit. So you have to move away from that, right? You have to get to a point where you understand the quality of the code that's produced, that contributing to something doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be accepted, it won't be reused and recycled. And that comes back to what we call open source and how we define it. So if in your policy, your processes, you are not really clear, what happens is your policy has that legal definition, right? It will say that you have a proper open source license and you share the source code. But what will happen is you'll create a GitHub wasteland where people just dump code and nobody will touch it because it doesn't follow good practice. The people who've created it don't have the right skills. They've not built documentation. They've not got compliance plans. They've not got contribution documentation or processes. They don't know how to build a community. They don't know where to take the code so that people engage with it and where to disseminate it. You know, it's an art form to do all this stuff. So I think what we're going to see is increasingly a little bit of pressure perhaps on you, but a challenge for you, which is to build code of the same quality as the whole industry. I think we'll see a shift for you where the code that's coming out of academia is expected to be as good as the open source code is expected to be, as the enterprise code is expected to be, because software is software. And if you want your software to really have impact, to really be of value and to be used, it's going to have to start to lift to those standards. And the good thing about open source, I guess, is you can get engaged and involved in the project and learn through that contribution, that personal contribution, some of it. And that will give you a living CV on GitHub, as we like to say. Now, I know that that isn't enough, right? You also need a career trajectory. You need to know that when you're contributing, those contributions are going to be recognized. They're not just going to be recognized in your current job by your employer, but across the industry. And that means that you need to have acknowledgement, you need pay rises, you need bonuses. It's hard to get any of those right now, but you need those things, and you need to know that one thing will take you to the next, will take you to the next. So there needs to be a career path for you. What I do not think you need, and was a topic of conversation yesterday, is to be certified. And there are organizations in the UK pushing for the certification, which they will then charge you for, which is why I think they're pushing for it. And when you talk to people outside of the UK, they laugh, right? So you don't want your representation talking to the OECD about frameworks of process and practices for you, looking at certification, in my opinion. It's a nonsense. Coding's a, freedom of speech. However, if you want your code to be used and reused, it's going to have to meet a certain standard. Software Heritage, you were very, very good. Were there yesterday. They have managed to look at the French marketplace and to describe that French marketplace in the public sector and in particular academia as to usage and creation of open source. So we're talking to them about trying to get a UK set of metrics and map to show who's doing what in the UK. They're quite good in terms of curation and practices, but there are lots of practices out there that you can find. There's things like Open Chain, which has a lot of the governance for free. It's a standard. There's a whole load of stuff that the open source community can help you with in terms of those good practices and tools. In the coffee break, somebody was talking to me about having had some Google engineers seconded in, and one of the challenges they had was that the tools they use in Google aren't open source, so weren't publicly available. And I think you'll see more of a shift to making some of those tools publicly available. It's not so much a competitive advantage to have them anymore. There's an AI project that came out of Paris called Roost, R-O-O-S-T, Roost.ai. And it's got a whole load of tools that the big techs have already donated and open sourced in terms of AI development. AI, I'm trying to avoid in this talk, but I've mentioned it. There's a whole debate about whether it's helping SREs, RSEs even, in terms of the quality of the code that they're creating, or whether it's a hindrance, because ultimately the tools help, but you still have to be able to exercise a level of discernment, because the AI is going to tell you you're great. It's never going to tell you that's bad code. One of the other things that was in the conversation was sunsetting. I talked about a GitHub wasteland. It's important to realize that not all code lives forever, and to allow things to pass as and when the time is right. But you are also, as you make those contributions, having these same challenges that we're seeing the open source community and its maintainers having. You're going to have to get paid, you're going to have to get recognized, as I've said. And I think, not encouraging you to unionize, but I think there's a movement you need to be inputting if you want to have a say in what the standards you're going to be held to are. A little bit beyond open source, I guess. Some of you may have seen GitHub produced a report talking about building a sovereign tech fund for open source for the EU. Germany already has one. Their sovereign tech fund is already morphed into a sovereign tech agency. And my belief is it will continue to morph until it gets to the point of being a foundation. So you probably all know Linux Foundation. It's the obvious place to put code. Bit of a problem because we've got one massive foundation and we don't have many others. We're going to need a lot more of those foundations to manage the governance and the curation. I've mentioned in this press quote that we're working with the UK public sector. So we've done a suite of proposals to UKRI about 6 months ago, which look at sustainable software from the perspective of open source. So if you want to build software that's sustainable, it's going to have to be open. We acknowledge that not every piece will be, but fundamentally the base of it needs to be open. So we've given them a suite of recommendations as a user and as a funder to move away from this sort of concept that you simply stick the code in GitHub and walk away from it, which we see happen time and again. I'm not allowed to go through all of those recommendations at this stage. I can tell you that we workshopped it last week with DCIT, that we've got engagements from other government departments, and what we're trying to achieve is that we have an output that is something that will work across the whole public sector, including academia. Now, that doesn't mean one size fits all, because we know it doesn't. There has to be variations within it. But those variations are going to come from the detail of the practicalities rather than the overall policy. So if I say to you something that's probably not a surprise, which is that we recommended setting up a foundation for the UK, and in that foundation you would have support in the governance and the management of code that was publicly funded. And then we would look at the good code and whether we can make some of that monetize and some of it won't. So you'll see more on this over the next few months, and I'll try and come back through the conference organizers to make sure that that's something that gets to all of you. So just to conclude, what's going to happen? I think we will see a shift in policy at a national level, where we'll see open source being treated as a public good, as a default, and we'll see that across not just the UK, but many countries who will then collaborate together. I have to go in a few minutes. These are my contacts, Open UK's contacts. If any of you want to get involved, great. That will also take you to the conference day of OpenCon. I think we have 5 minutes for questions. Anybody got any questions? I don't know if I'm doing this for somebody else.
Online Slido platform. So I'm going to go through in order. If anyone hasn't found it yet, you can find Slido through the event hub. You can ask questions and you can also upvote other people's questions so we know what people really want to know. So our first is, many of us work at British universities where broader IT services are largely still on proprietary software. Do you have any advice on how we could campaign to move them away from some of this?
It's interesting. Bring together a group of people and come and talk to us. So I'm happy to take this conversation to government, and I know government is having it with some of the public sector as well. I will say there are certain things that the front end is not as good in open source. We've never been able to get that over the line. I worked in an operating system for 5 years, so there'll always be pushback. But I think the key for us is to find ways that we get code bases, we get tools that are being used that are open, and that is the collective voice that will make that shift. So whoever's asked that question, please feel free to come and speak to us with a group of people and we'll see what we can do.
We also have, what is your opinion on licenses such as the GPL, which restrict reuse by requiring constraints on such reuse?
They only require you to do what's considered good practice. So it's called, depending on who you speak to, it used to be called a viral effect, which upset everybody and it made lawyers panic. What it does is it allows you to insist that anybody who uses your open source code keeps what they do with the open if they distribute it. So when we had Ubuntu, Google used to use it internally and call it Ubuntu and not redistribute it with their own version of Ubuntu. So if you don't distribute, you don't have to. And that fixes a lot of the platform problems because you've got it underneath your platforms. I don't think it's a bad thing, but if you don't want things like your code becoming infected, there are technical ways of doing your linking, etc. And like most challenges I see in technology or software, the solution isn't a legal or a licensing one. The solution is practical and about how you do it, not complying with some standard or regulation.
I think we have time for one more. So I would say,
are they all online? Are we letting anybody, does anybody in the room have a question? Maybe I've just talked at you so much you're done.
So we should be
they're doing
getting
it
through the online platform just so that everybody gets
yeah.
there.
I don't get to see you out, so that's a bit.
Let's see. Open source industrial plans. Some researchers worry that releasing their code under an open source license will make it more difficult to secure funding from industrial partners.
Yeah.
Is there any evidence to support or refute this?
It's interesting. So I will be honest in that once you've open sourced something, it's not easy to make money. Making money out of open source is the holy grail. However, if you're in the Bay Area and you're talking to VCs, they expect the code to be open and they expect you to monetize. Don't do it if you want to get investment and monetization, unless you're sure you know how you're doing it, what the consequences are, where the money's coming from. If your funders require you to have patents, open source folks tend not to like them, but it's not the end of the world. We have various tactics to defend against patents and open source. We have an organization called Open Invention Network. It's the world's biggest defensive IP organization. It's currently free to join if anybody's interested. It will have a fee after Christmas. And what it does is it has something called a mutual hold harmless. So everybody signs up to say they won't sue each other if their patents are used with respect to open source. They can still sue if it's proprietary, but not if it's open source. And that was set up by some of the big techs, and it has pretty much all of the big techs with one or two notable exceptions in it. And those notable exceptions, if you go and look for them and you find they're not there, in mobile you'll find Nokia and Ericsson among them. Those are likely to be the folks who are going to be aggressive towards open source. But it covers you in the main, and it puts you in a group of over 4,000 organizations who are ready to sort of unite and push back against any patent force or trolls.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, thank you.